Ukraine.
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 Ukraine. You've probably heard about that country a lot. For the last few years, Ukraine has been one of the most important conflict points in the world. It's the site of a proxy war between Russia and the United States.
Russia could launch an attack on Ukraine any day now.
We are ready, and all of NATO is ready.
But it's also a place most people don't really know a lot about. So the story we hear about Ukraine's history and its conflict today has very little relationship to reality. I'm going to tell you a story about modern Ukraine, but this is also a story about America and how American money and weapons ended up in the hands of these guys, the neo-Nazis and ultranationalists of Ukraine's far right. Let's start in 1991, when Ukraine became fully independent from the Soviet Union. And independence was tough. After the fall of communism, the economies of post-Soviet republics were falling apart. State institutions were being hollowed out. A so-called gangster capitalism was becoming dominant. So in the 1990s, Ukraine's economy and quality of life collapsed, and it's never really gotten better. Adjusted for inflation, Ukraine's GDP per capita was higher in 1990 than it was in 2020. Health outcomes are abysmal. In 2019, the life expectancy of Ukrainian men was lower than in Syria, Iraq, and North Korea. And as quality of life collapsed, nationalism flourished. Some people turned to extremist politics. And that was partly because Ukrainian nationalism, formed in opposition to the Soviet Union, tended to have a strongly right-wing flavor. To understand that, we have to look at a crucial figure in Ukrainian nationalist history, a guy named Stepan Bandera. You see, in the 1930s and 40s, Bandera wanted Ukrainian independence from Poland and the Soviet Union. So when the Nazis invaded, Bandera allied with them. His followers massacred huge numbers of Poles and Jews. But in spite of this legacy, Bandera is still viewed as a hero in the west of Ukraine. There are Stepan Bandera streets, museums, and monuments. In 2010, Bandera was even named an official hero of Ukraine. But Bandera is hated in the East, where Soviet identity was historically a lot stronger. And that East-West divide was a big fracture within Ukraine. In Western Ukraine, there was more stress on a specifically Ukrainian identity, closer to Europe. In Eastern Ukraine, meanwhile, people were more likely to stress their historic ties to Russia and the Russian language. Fast forward to 2010, when Ukraine elected a relatively pro-Russian politician named Viktor Yanukovych as its president, with strong support from voters in the East. Yanukovych pursued a regionalist and Russia-friendly agenda, which angered people in the West. And in 2013, Yanukovych announced that he was suspending discussions on Ukrainian integration with Europe. That decision sparked a protest movement centered in Kyiv called Euromaidan, after the Maidan Square where it took place.
In Kiev, thousands of Ukrainians continue to protest against the government's decision to hold off on signing a deal with the EU.
In the West, Euromaidan was seen as a peaceful, pro-democracy movement, and most participants really were ordinary people who were angry at the government. But as the protests grew, encouraged by a harsh repression from the police and a brutal sniper attack that killed dozens of protesters and police alike, a new, more sinister element emerged and began to hijack the movement. The ultranationalists came on the scene.
It was often the nationalists who were the loudest and the most violent. A group calling itself the Right Sector is perhaps the largest. Its members can be seen marching around Kiev in columns of about a dozen.
Groups like the, quote, Right Sector, the ultranationalist Svoboda Party, originally called the Social National Party of Ukraine, try turning those words around, acted as a small but influential organized minority within the protests. And those extremists played an important role in exacerbating the protests by encouraging violence and more radical rhetoric. There are allegations that the sniper attack was actually orchestrated by the Right Sector and its co-conspirators. By early 2014, the government lost the ability to control the protests.
In a rapidly evolving political crisis, President Yanukovych has been voted out by parliament, forced to leave Kiev.
And the US recognized interim government that replaced him had a significant far-right faction. The Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, and others were all from that far-right party, Svoboda. And this led to backlash in the East, because Eastern Ukrainians were horrified at what they saw as a far-right seizure of power, with veneration of Bandera and elimination of equal recognition for languages like Russian.
Service industry workers have since January been obliged to talk to customers in Ukrainian unless clients specifically ask to switch.
If I work, pay my employees' salaries and my taxes, it's none of your bloody business which language I do it in.
Anti-government protests broke out across the East. In the eastern peninsula of Crimea, people were furious. Many of them talked about joining Russia, so the Russian government saw an opportunity. They wanted to encourage a surge of Russian nationalism for its own benefit. So Russia annexed Crimea and held a disputed referendum to legitimize the decision.
As many as 95.5% of the electorate in Crimea have voted to join Russia. We are going back home. Crimea is in Russia.
Energized by the annexation and supported by Russian armed and military personnel, the anti-government protests became a full-blown secessionist movement. Eastern provinces like Donetsk and Luhansk held separatist referendums and declared independence. The new government branded these rebellions as, quote, terrorist actions. Ukraine entered a civil war, which was also a proxy war with Russia. But after decades of austerity and corruption, the Ukrainian army was totally unable to fight. So a lot of the action fell instead to the people who were the most violent, the ultranationalists. So a new paramilitary emerged. It was called the Azov Battalion. And unlike the official Ukrainian military, Azov's volunteers were willing to go the distance. But Azov wasn't just any random organization. It was a pretty disturbing far-right group. It had come out of neo-Nazi street gangs that had been used as muscle by Ukrainian elites in the 90s and 2000s. Azov members regularly sported tattoos of swastikas. Their symbol was based on a Nazi emblem. Their leader declared that their mission was to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led Untermenschen, subhumans. But Azov's neo-Nazism turned out not to be such a huge concern to the Ukrainian government. Because in 2014, a guy named Arsen Avakov became Interior Minister in charge of police and security. And Avakov had been a long-time patron of the neo-Nazi gangs. And when he was a regional governor, he used them as enforcers. So when he became Interior Minister, Avakov had the Azov Battalion incorporated into Ukraine's National Guard. Ukraine is the only country to have a neo-Nazi formation in its military. So as the war was heating up, the US government announced it would start helping the Ukrainian government.
We're upholding the principle that bigger nations can't bully the small by opposing Russian aggression and supporting Ukraine's democracy and reassuring our NATO allies.
It would send money, training, and, quote, defensive lethal aid, weapons. And as all that flowed in, Azov became a beneficiary. The research group Bellingcat showed that Azov was receiving access to American grenade launchers. A Daily Beast investigation showed that US trainers were unable to prevent aid from reaching neo-Nazis. And Azov itself posted a video of the unit welcoming representatives from NATO. Some in the US were concerned about all of this. They warned that arming neo-Nazis would pose a threat to Ukrainian minorities and to Ukrainian democracy. But whenever Congress tried to ban funding for Azov, the Defense Department had those provisions removed. So the US continued funding Azov for years. It wasn't until 2018 that funding was banned, and that the State Department labeled Azov a, quote, nationalist hate group. Ukraine is still mired in a war on its territory, and the Russian government likes to use Ukrainian nationalists in its propaganda, part of its practice of painting all Ukrainians as Nazis. Of course, those claims aren't really true. But Ukraine still does have a serious and militarized neo-Nazi problem, and Western support extends beyond Azov. Even today, far-right groups continue to benefit from training by Western countries. American politicians have met with far-right leaders.
People of Ukraine, this is your moment.
During the protests, American Senator John McCain made a public appearance with a leader of the far-right Svoboda party. This guy. He had previously been kicked out of Ukraine's parliament for extreme anti-Semitism. And here's that same guy meeting with then Vice President Joe Biden. So since the 2014 uprising, Ukraine's far right has become increasingly powerful. Azov veterans have been given high positions in the security services. In 2016, Andriy Parubiy, pictured here when he was leading a neo-Nazi party in the 90s, became Speaker of the Ukrainian parliament, even as he continued to offer praise for Adolf Hitler. Here's Parubiy meeting with John McCain. The new Ukrainian government even made it a criminal offense to deny Bandera's heroism. And in 2021, the United States and Ukraine were the only two countries to vote against a UN resolution condemning the glorification of Nazism. A climate of impunity has developed around far-right violence. Attacks against Roma and gay people go unpunished. A 2018 report found that Ukraine had more incidents of anti-Semitic hate crimes than all other post-Soviet republics combined. So that's the story of how the far right helped cause the country to fracture. But it's also a story about America, how America's support helped legitimize the far right and allowed it to build influence. And that's a pattern you see over and over in American foreign policy, getting involved in places we don't really understand and supporting groups, lesser evils, that we think serve our interests, and then being surprised when the blowback hits us in the face. In Central America, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and now in Ukraine. I'm Hadiya Afzal, Advocacy Associate for Just Foreign Policy for the Gravel Institute.